Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the blood-soaked sand of the Colosseum. We're not a spectator cheering from marble seats. You're the main event. You feel the weight of unfamiliar armor strapped to your trembling body as 50,000 Romans scream for entertainment that only your potential death can provide. The Iron Gate creaks open behind you, and there's no turning back now. You probably won't survive this, but then again, that's exactly what they're hoping for. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing this community span the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're thrust into Rome's twisted entertainment machine, where death became spectacle and human life became disposable commodity. The year is 73 AD, and you've just become property of the Roman state after being captured in some forgotten border skirmish. Maybe you were a Thracian farmer who picked up a sword to defend your village, or perhaps a Germanic tribesman who thought you could outrun Roman cavalry. It doesn't matter now. Your previous life ended the moment those chains locked around your wrists. The concept of gladiatorial combat didn't spring from Roman minds like Athena from Zeus's head. It evolved from Etruscan funeral rites where prisoners were forced to fight to honor dead nobles. The Romans, never ones to waste a good idea, transformed this somber ritual into mass entertainment. What started as a handful of fighters at private funerals became elaborate state-sponsored spectacles featuring hundreds of combatants. The first recorded gladiatorial games in Rome happened in 264 BC, and by your time, they've become the ultimate expression of Roman power and cruelty. You stand in the holding area beneath the Colosseum, and the engineering marvel above you represents everything wrong with human ingenuity. This isn't just an arena. It's a machine designed to process human suffering into public joy. The hypogeum, the underground maze where you wait, contains an intricate system of pulleys, trapdoors, and elevators that can launch wild animals, scenery, or condemn men like yourself into the arena above. Roman engineers spent years perfecting ways to make death more entertaining, and you're about to become their latest test subject. The economics of your situation are brutally simple. You cost money to buy, feed, and train, but you generate more money through ticket sales, betting, and the prestige your death brings to whoever sponsored today's games. Historians still argue whether gladiators were primarily war prisoners, criminals, or volunteers, but the reality is that most of you are here because you had no choice. The volunteer gladiators, the octorati, were usually desperate men drowning in debt who signed contracts trading their freedom for the slim chance of prize money and glory. Your fellow fighters come from across the empire, Gauls with their distinctive long swords, Thracians with curved daggers, Samnites with their traditional heavy armor. Each represents a conquered people, and your combat serves as a reminder of Roman dominance. When you fight and die, you're not just entertaining the crowd. You're performing Rome's superiority over the barbarian world. The audience sees their enemies destroying each other for their amusement, a twisted form of historical reenactment where the conquered repeatedly lose. The smell hits you first, a mixture of sawdust, blood, and fierce sweat that no amount of cleaning can eliminate. The arena's sand above has been changed, but it's still stained dark in patches where yesterday's fighters bled out. You realize this sand has absorbed the final moments of hundreds, maybe thousands, of men just like you. Some were brave, some cowardly, some skilled, some helpless, but they all ended up feeding the same insatiable appetite for violence that brought you here. The crowd's roar filters down through the stone corridors, a sound like distant thunder that makes your bones vibrate. These aren't just Romans in the stands. They're citizens of the greatest empire the world has ever known, and they've come to watch you die for their entertainment. Senators sit in the front rows, their togas pristine white against the blood-spattered sand. Behind them, the merchant class in their fine tunics, then the common plebs, and finally the slaves and freedmen in the cheap seats. Every social stratum of Roman society has gathered to watch your suffering, united in their desire to see you bleed. You stand naked on the auction block as wealthy Lanisti examine your muscles like livestock, purchasing your entire existence for the price of a decent horse. The slave market reeks of unwashed bodies, fear, and the oil used to make skin glisten under the harsh Mediterranean sun. Potential buyers circle you like vultures, prodding your arms, checking your teeth, discussing your probable lifespan as if you weren't standing right there listening to every word. The Lanista, the gladiator trainer and owner who's considering buying you, runs his fingers along your shoulder muscles, testing their firmness. His name is Marcus Aurelius Scaurus, and he owns one of Rome's most successful gladiator schools. To him, you're not a person, but an investment, a piece of equipment that might generate profit if properly maintained and skillfully deployed. He's calculating how many fights you might survive, how much training you'll need, and whether your death will be spectacular enough to enhance his reputation. This one's got good bone structure, Scaurus mutters to his assistant, a scarred ex-gladiator named Titus who survived long enough to earn his freedom. Broad shoulders, strong thighs. Might make a decent Murmillo if we can teach him to use a shield properly. They're discussing your future fighting style based on your physical attributes, like a trainer examining a racehorse. Your opinions on the matter are irrelevant. You're merchandise now, and merchandise doesn't get to choose its purpose. The bidding starts at 50 denarii, roughly what a skilled craftsman earns in 2 months. It's insulting how little your life is worth. But then again, most gladiators don't last long enough to justify higher prices. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice like a rusty gate, rattles off your supposed qualities. Strong back, all teeth, no obvious diseases, probably good for at least 3 fights before he breaks. The crowd of potential buyers chuckles at this assessment of your durability. Historians still argue whether the gladiator trade was primarily driven by military prisoners or criminal convictions, but the slave markets didn't care about the source of their merchandise. You might be here because you were captured in Germania, or because you couldn't pay your debts, or because you were condemned for some minor crime. The result is the same. Your property now, and property doesn't have rights, dignity, or hope. The auction block is worn smooth by countless feet of condemned men who stood where you stand now. Some were warriors from distant lands, others were criminals or political prisoners, but they all shared your current fate. Their stories are forgotten, their names lost to history, but their suffering echoes in the very stones beneath your feet. You're just the latest in an endless procession of human merchandise feeding Rome's appetite for blood sport. Scaurus wins the bidding at 75 denarii, not because you're particularly impressive, but because he's developed an eye for potential gladiators over his 20 years in the business. He's bought and buried more fighters than he can remember, and he sees something in your build that suggests you might survive long enough to recoup his investment. To you, it's the moment your life ends. To him, it's Tuesday. The transfer of ownership is surprisingly bureaucratic. Papers are signed, money changes hands, and suddenly you belong to someone else completely. Roman law is very clear about the rights of slaves. You have none. Your new owner can work you to death, beat you for entertainment, or sell you to someone worse without explanation or apology. The only protection you have is his desire to protect his investment, and that protection extends only as long as you remain profitable. You're branded with Scaurus's mark, a crude S, burned into your shoulder with a hot iron. The pain is excruciating, but it's nothing compared to the psychological burn of being marked like cattle. This brand will follow you for the rest of your probably short life, identifying you as property of the Scaurus ludus. If you somehow survive long enough to earn your freedom, the scar will remain as a permanent reminder of your time as a slave gladiator. The other newly purchased gladiators share your hollow-eyed expression of shock and despair. There's a young Gallic warrior who keeps touching his neck where his torque was removed, a sign of his lost status. Next to him stands a former Roman citizen who fell into debt and was sold to pay his creditors. His shame is almost palpable. The group represents the empire's diversity, but you're all united now by chains and the grim knowledge that you've been purchased to die for entertainment. As you're led away from the auction block in chains, You catch a glimpse of the forum's normal business continuing around you. Citizens shop for vegetables, argue over cloth prices, and conduct the mundane business of daily life while ignoring the human cargo being herded past them. Your transformation from person to property is so routine that it barely registers in the consciousness of free Romans. You've become invisible, a ghost walking among the living. You enter the ludus where brutal trainers beat discipline into your bones and survival becomes your only curriculum. The gladiator school walls rise around you like a prison, which is exactly what it is, a specialized facility designed to turn human beings into efficient killing machines. The gates clang shut behind you with a finality that makes your stomach drop. There's no appeal process here, no lawyer to argue your case. You're property now, and property learns to obey or gets broken. Your first instructor is a retired gladiator named Gaius Valerius, a man whose face tells the story of a dozen near-death experiences. His left eye is clouded white from an old sword cut, and his right arm bears the parallel scars of claw marks from some long-dead beast. He survived 15 years in the arena, an almost impossible feat that earned him his freedom and a position training the next generation of condemned men. Now he looks at you with the cold assessment of someone who's seen 1,000 hopefuls enter these walls and buried most of them. You think you're warriors. Valerius growls at your group of new arrivals, but you're not. You're meat that doesn't know it's dead yet. My job is to teach you how to die entertainingly, and maybe, how to live long enough to die another day. His voice carries the authority of someone who's stared death in the face repeatedly and somehow kept breathing. The brutal honesty is almost refreshing after the false promises of the slave dealers. The training begins immediately with wooden weapons heavier than their steel counterparts. You're handed a wooden sword that weighs twice what a real gladius would, and a shield that makes your arm ache just holding it. This isn't cruelty for its own sake. It's practical. If you can fight effectively with heavy training weapons, the lighter combat gear will feel like feathers in your hands. Of course, the real reason is that wooden weapons are cheaper to replace when you inevitably break them during training. Your first lesson is learning to fall properly. It sounds ridiculous, but as Valerius demonstrates, there's an art to taking a blow that might save your life. The crowd wants to see impact. He explains while knocking you flat with a training sword. Give them a dramatic fall, and they might think you're more hurt than you are. Sometimes that extra second of surprise is the difference between breathing and bleeding out in the sand. The ludus operates on a strict hierarchy that makes Roman social structure look egalitarian. At the top are the veteran gladiators who survived enough fights to earn respect and slightly better treatment. Below them are the promising newcomers who show potential. At the bottom are fresh slaves like you, who are expected to provide target practice for their betters while learning the fundamentals of armed combat. The pecking order is enforced with casual violence that makes military discipline look gentle. Your training schedule begins before dawn and ends after dusk. Breakfast is a handful of barley and whatever scraps the kitchen slaves can spare. Then it's hours of weapon drills, combat practice, and physical conditioning that would kill a normal person. The afternoon brings more weapons training, this time with different fighting styles. You learn that gladiators aren't just random fighters. They're specialized performers, each with specific equipment, techniques, and roles in the arena's deadly theater. Historians still argue whether gladiator training was primarily about spectacle or genuine military preparation, but the reality you experience is a combination of both. You're learning to fight, yes, but you're also learning to perform. The crowd wants drama, not just violence. They want to see fear, courage, desperation, and triumph played out in blood and sweat. Your life depends on your ability to give them an entertaining show, not just an efficient kill. The medical training is perhaps the most grimly practical aspect of your education. You learn to recognize fatal wounds versus survivable ones, how to control bleeding, and how to make a dramatic death scene if the situation calls for it. The ludus doctor, a freedman named Hippocrates who clearly wasn't named for his bedside manner, teaches you basic anatomy with the enthusiasm of someone explaining how to butcher a pig. This is where you stab for a quick death, he says, pointing to the base of the skull. And this is where you cut for a slow, crowd-pleasing one. The psychological aspect of training is perhaps the cruelest element. You're not just learning to fight. You're learning to suppress your humanity. Valerius forces you to kill wounded training partners, not because it's necessary, but because mercy is a luxury gladiators can't afford. Hesitation kills, he repeats like a mantra, and the crowd can smell weakness like blood in the water. You watch decent men transform into efficient killers, and you feel the same change happening to yourself. The weapons training reveals the sophisticated brutality of gladiatorial combat. You might become a retiarius, fighting with net and trident, or a secutor with sword and shield, or a thraex with curved sword and small shield. Each style has its own techniques, advantages, and weaknesses. The trainers match fighting styles to your physical attributes and temperament, turning your natural abilities into tools for the arena's entertainment. Your body is being sculpted into a weapon, and your mind is being molded to wield it without hesitation. You sleep in cramped barracks with fellow condemned souls, sharing disease, despair, and the stench of impending doom. The sleeping quarters of the ludus make a Roman prison look luxurious, which is fitting since you're essentially serving a death sentence with the possibility of postponement. 20 men share a room barely large enough for 10, sleeping on straw mattresses that haven't been changed since the last plague swept through the barracks. The smell is a nauseating mixture of unwashed bodies, fierce sweat, and the lingering odor of men who've given up hope. Your bunk is a wooden frame with rope supports that sag under even modest weight. The straw mattress is thin enough that you can feel every imperfection in the wooden slats beneath you, and it's infested with bugs that seem to view your blood as their personal banquet. Sleep becomes a luxury you can rarely afford, not just because of the discomfort, but because nightmares of the arena plague your few hours of rest. You dream of crowds screaming for your death, of swords sliding between your ribs, of sand turning red with your blood. The men around you represent the dregs of the empire, but also its diversity. There's Marcus, a former Roman citizen who fell into debt and was sold to pay his creditors. His shame is so profound he barely speaks. Next to him sleeps Brutus, a Gallic warrior who killed 3 Roman soldiers before being captured, and who spends his nights planning impossible escapes. In the corner lies Demetrius, a Greek scholar who was condemned for some political offense he won't discuss. Each man carries his own tragedy, but you're all united by the certainty that you'll probably die horribly for the entertainment of people who don't know your names. The latrines are a special kind of hell that would make hardened soldiers weep. 20 men sharing 2 holes in the ground. No privacy, no dignity, and no soap. Disease spreads through the barracks like wildfire, and the ludus management considers it a cost of doing business. They factor illness into their calculations the same way they factor weapon breakage or food spoilage. You're not people to them. You're inventory, and sometimes inventory gets damaged. Personal hygiene is nearly impossible under these conditions. You're allowed to bathe once a week in cold water that's been used by dozens of men before you. The soap is a harsh-lime mixture that leave your skin raw and cracked. Your hair becomes matted and filthy. Your nails grow long and broken, and your teeth start to decay from the poor diet and lack of cleaning. The physical degradation is almost as demoralizing as the psychological pressure of knowing you're being prepared for slaughter. Privacy doesn't exist in the gladiator barracks. You dress, undress, eat, sleep, and suffer in full view of your fellow prisoners. Personal possessions are forbidden. Anything you own before your enslavement is gone, and anything you acquire in the ludus belongs to your owner. You can't even keep a letter from home, assuming anyone from your old life would risk association with a condemned gladiator. Your identity is being systematically stripped away, leaving only a weapon waiting for deployment. The relationships you form in the barracks are complicated by the knowledge that you might have to kill each other in the arena. Friendships develop despite the circumstances, but they're poisoned by the reality that tomorrow's training partner might be next week's opponent. Historians still argue whether gladiators were deliberately kept isolated to prevent bonding, but the evidence suggests that the psychological pressure of potential combat against friends was considered part of the training process. Sleep, when it comes, offers no escape from your circumstances. The sounds of the barracks at night tell their own story. Muffled sobbing from men who think they're being quiet, the muttered prayers of those still clinging to hope, the occasional scream from someone reliving arena combat in their dreams. Some men talk in their sleep, revealing fears and regrets they'd never voice while conscious. Others lie awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the days until their probable death. The rats in the barracks are almost as large as cats, and they've learned to be bold around humans. They scurry across sleeping men, steal food from the communal bowls, and generally act as if they own the place, which in a sense they do. The rats will outlive all of you, and they know it. They're the only creatures in the ludus who don't live in fear, and there's something deeply disturbing about being envious of rodents. Food storage in the barracks is a constant battle against vermin, spoilage, and theft. The small amounts of extra food you might earn through good performance and training have to be hidden and consumed quickly before they rot or get stolen. Some men become obsessed with hoarding scraps, creating little caches of moldy bread and rancid meat that they guard like treasure. The desperation for even the smallest comfort or advantage transforms reasonable men into paranoid misers. The medical care available to gladiator slaves is barely worthy of the name. The ludus doctor treats injuries and illnesses with all the compassion of a veterinarian working on livestock, which is essentially what you are to him. Broken bones are set without pain relief. Infections are treated with whatever herbs are cheapest, and serious illnesses are often treated by simply replacing the sick gladiator with a healthy one. Your value is measured by your ability to fight, and once that's gone, you're just another expense to be eliminated. Discipline in the barracks is maintained through a system of collective punishment that turns the prisoners against each other. If one man breaks a rule, everyone suffers the consequences. This creates an atmosphere of mutual surveillance and resentment that prevents organized resistance. You learn to hate your fellow prisoners as much as your captors, and you realize that this psychological manipulation is just another form of training for the arena, where survival often depends on your willingness to kill men who might have been your friends. The priest's blessing before your bout sounds hollow when you realize he's essentially asking the gods to help you commit murder more efficiently, and the cognitive dissonance of receiving divine sanction for activities that any moral system should condemn leave you spiritually adrift in a way that's almost harder to bear than the physical dangers of combat. Roman religion is supposed to provide structure, meaning, and divine protection. But when your profession involves regularly violating the most basic moral principles, the entire theological framework starts to feel like an elaborate joke being played at your expense. The pre-fight rituals involve prayers to Mars for strength, Mercury for speed, and Fortuna for luck, but you're increasingly aware that you're simultaneously praying for your opponent's defeat and possibly death, while he's probably offering the same prayers about you. The gods are being asked to choose sides in a conflict that exists purely for entertainment value, which raises uncomfortable questions about divine priorities and moral consistency that the priests never seem interested in addressing during their hurried benedictions. Your relationship with the traditional Roman pantheon becomes complicated by the fact that different gods seem to have conflicting interests in gladiatorial outcomes. Mars might favor the stronger fighter, but Mercury could support the more skilled one, while Fortuna might randomly decide to help whoever she finds more amusing that day. It's like trying to navigate a bureaucracy where different departments are actively working against each other, and your survival depends on filing the right paperwork with the right divine office. The mystery religions that attract many gladiators promise spiritual salvation that transcends earthly concerns, but even these alternative belief systems struggle with the moral implications of professional violence. Mithraism, with its emphasis on courage and martial virtue, seems more compatible with gladiatorial life. But the requirement for ritual purity becomes problematic when your job involves regularly spilling blood for entertainment. You're caught between spiritual traditions that can't quite accommodate the realities of your profession. Historians still argue whether gladiators were genuinely religious or if their spiritual practices were primarily superstitious insurance policies against bad luck. But from your perspective, kneeling in the sand before a fight, the distinction seems irrelevant. You're praying because you're desperate, because humans in extreme situations naturally reach for anything that might provide comfort or advantage, even if the theological framework doesn't entirely make sense. The temple visits become exercises in spiritual confusion because you're asking for divine protection while simultaneously preparing to violate divine law. The priests take your donations and offer their blessings, but there's an uncomfortable transactional quality to the interactions that suggests everyone involved understands the moral compromises being made. It's religious theater performed by people who aren't entirely convinced by their own script. The afterlife considerations are particularly troubling because Roman religious traditions don't provide clear guidance about the spiritual fate of people who kill for entertainment. Will the gods judge you based on your intentions, your actions, or the social context of your violence? Are gladiatorial deaths somehow different from other forms of killing because they occur in a religious and civic context? The priests offer reassuring platitudes, but their uncertainty is obvious to anyone asking serious theological questions. The spiritual emptiness you experience isn't just about religious doubt. It's about the absence of moral framework that can adequately address the contradictions of gladiatorial life. You're simultaneously celebrated and condemned, honored and shamed, blessed and cursed, and the cognitive dissonance creates a psychological void that traditional spiritual practices can't fill. You're spiritually homeless in a culture that supposedly provides religious guidance for every aspect of life. The communal aspects of Roman religion become complicated by your gladiatorial status, because your presence at public ceremonies reminds other worshippers of the violence that underlies their entertainment. Families move away from you during temple services, not because they're afraid of physical harm, but because they're uncomfortable being reminded that their religious community includes people who kill others professionally. Your spiritual contamination affects the perceived purity of communal worship. The prayer practices you develop as a gladiator often involve bargaining with deities in ways that would be considered inappropriate in other contexts. You're not asking for general divine favor or spiritual enlightenment. You're negotiating for specific advantages in life or death situations. The prayers become transactional rather than transformational, focused on immediate survival rather than long-term spiritual development. The religious artifacts and protective amulets that many gladiators carry represent a kind of magical thinking that coexists uneasily with official Roman religious doctrine. You wear charms blessed by priests, carry tokens from mystery religions, and perform personal rituals that combine elements from different theological traditions because you're willing to try anything that might provide even marginal advantages in combat. It's spiritual eclecticism born of desperation rather than theological sophistication. The seasonal religious festivals create particularly acute spiritual dissonance because they often coincide with major gladiatorial games. You're participating in celebrations of divine favor and community harmony while simultaneously preparing to engage in mortal combat for public entertainment. The juxtaposition of religious joy and gladiatorial violence highlights the moral contradictions that Roman society generally prefers to ignore. The most profound spiritual challenge of gladiatorial life is the gradual erosion of your ability to believe in any coherent moral universe. When survival depends on your willingness to kill people who've done you no personal harm, when success is measured by your entertainment value rather than your moral character, and when society simultaneously celebrates and condemns your actions, the foundations of ethical reasoning begin to crumble. You're left with a pragmatic nihilism that focuses on immediate survival rather than ultimate meaning, because the alternative, trying to maintain moral coherence in an inherently immoral situation, leads to psychological breakdown. The gladiator medical system operates on principles that would make a modern combat medic weep, combining genuine surgical innovation with practices that seem designed to maximize suffering rather than minimize it. When you're carried off the arena floor with a gaping wound, You're not heading to a sterile hospital room. You're going to what amounts to an ancient butcher shop where the doctors learned their trade by experimenting on slaves and prisoners who had no choice but to submit to whatever treatment seemed reasonable at the time. The arena's medical staff consists primarily of former army surgeons who've seen plenty of battlefield trauma, but battlefield medicine and gladiator medicine serve different purposes. On campaign, the goal is getting soldiers back to fighting condition as quickly as possible. In the gladiatorial context, the goal is keeping expensive fighting slaves alive long enough to recoup their training investment, which means you might receive treatment for wounds that would be considered fatal in other circumstances, but you'll also suffer through procedures that prioritize cost over comfort. Your first experience with gladiator medical care probably comes from training injuries, pulled muscles, cuts from wooden weapons, sprains from grappling practice. The medical slaves who handle routine treatment have learned to work fast and cheap, using whatever supplies are available and saving the expensive medicines for gladiators who generate significant revenue. You get your cuts cleaned with vinegar that burns like liquid fire, your sprains wrapped with reused bandages that smell like previous patients, and your pain managed with wine that's only slightly less acidic than the vinegar. The surgical procedures performed on seriously wounded gladiators represent both the pinnacle and a nadir of Roman medical knowledge. Arena doctors developed innovative techniques for treating penetrating wounds, broken bones, and massive blood loss because gladiators provided them with a steady stream of patients suffering from combat trauma. But they performed these procedures without anesthesia beyond wine and opium when available, which means you experience every cut, every stitch, and every bone setting in full, horrifying detail. Historians still argue whether gladiator mortality rates were higher from combat deaths or post-combat medical complications. But from your perspective lying on a blood-stained table while someone probes your wounds with unwashed instruments, the distinction seems purely academic. Infection kills more gladiators than swords, and the medical practices designed to prevent infection often introduce new sources of contamination that make recovery even more unlikely. The amputation procedures are particularly nightmarish because arena doctors have become skilled at removing damaged limbs while keeping patients alive, but they haven't figured out how to make the process anything less than excruciating. If your arm is mangled beyond repair, you'll be held down by several strong slaves while surgeon saws through bone and muscle, cauterizes blood vessels with hot iron, and stitches the stump closed with thread that may or may not be clean. The entire procedure takes place in a room where dozens of similar operations have been performed, and the smell of burned flesh and infected wounds creates an atmosphere that would challenge even the strongest stomach. The pain management options available to gladiator patients range from inadequate to non-existent. Wine is the most common anesthetic, but it's often watered down to stretch the supply, and drunk patients are harder to treat effectively. Opium is reserved for the most valuable gladiators or the most severe procedures, and even then it's administered in doses that barely take the edge off the agony. Most gladiators learn to bite down on leather straps and endure whatever treatment they receive with the stoic resignation of people who understand that complaining won't improve their situation. The recovery process is almost as dangerous as the initial injury because gladiator quarters aren't designed for medical care. You'll be placed in a small, poorly ventilated room with other wounded fighters, sharing space that's cleaned infrequently and with supplies that are stretched to cover as many patients as possible. The risk of cross-contamination is enormous, and minor infections can spread rapidly through the recovery area, turning treatable wounds into life-threatening complications. The psychological trauma of gladiator medical treatment receives no attention whatsoever because Roman medicine doesn't recognize mental health as a legitimate medical concern. You're expected to recover from having your arm amputated or your face carved up with the same emotional resilience you'd show after a minor training injury. The nightmares, anxiety, and depression that follow traumatic medical procedures are considered character flaws rather than predictable responses to extreme trauma. Some gladiators develop expertise in basic medical care out of necessity, learning to clean and dress wounds, set simple fractures, and recognize signs of serious infection. This knowledge is passed down informally between fighters because receiving prompt, competent medical attention can mean the difference between returning to the arena and dying slowly from preventable complications. But practicing medicine without official authorization can result in punishment, so gladiator medics operate in a legal gray area that adds another layer of risk to an already dangerous situation. The most disturbing aspect of gladiator medical care is how it reflects broader Roman attitudes toward human suffering. Free citizens receive better treatment than slaves, veteran gladiators receive better care than newcomers, and popular fighters receive better attention than those who haven't proven their entertainment value. Your worth as a patient is directly tied to your economic value as a performer, which means your access to competent medical care depends on how much money you can generate for your owners through your willingness to fight and potentially die for public amusement. The wooden sword ceremony is supposed to represent freedom, but you're starting to understand that the rudis is less a key to liberty and more a golden chain with a prettier design. After surviving dozens of arena bouts, accumulating scars like a living map of Roman entertainment, you've finally earned the theoretical right to retirement. Congratulations. You're now free to discover that freedom for a gladiator is about as real as a politician's campaign promises, and considerably more expensive to maintain. Your ludus owner doesn't simply release valuable assets because they've earned a symbolic wooden weapon. You represent years of training investment, medical costs, equipment expenses, and proven entertainment value. The retirement process involves financial negotiations that would make a modern corporate lawyer proud, and the price of your freedom is usually set just high enough to ensure you'll never actually afford it. It's like being told you can buy your way out of prison, but the cost is equivalent to your lifetime earnings plus interest compounded daily. The few gladiators who do manage to secure actual retirement discover that their career options in civilian life are remarkably limited. Roman society views ex-gladiators with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. You're famous enough to be recognized on the street, but infamous enough that respectable businesses won't hire you. Your skill set consists primarily of knowing how to kill people entertainingly, which doesn't translate well to most legitimate professions, and your social connections are limited to other people who've spent their careers getting stabbed for public amusement. Many retired gladiators end up working as trainers in the same ludus system they supposedly escaped, teaching new recruits the same deadly skills that earned their own freedom. It's a circular trap that keeps you trapped in the gladiatorial world even after you've stopped fighting actively. You trade the risk of dying in the arena for the certainty of spending your remaining years preparing other people to die in the arena, which is progress of a sort, but not the kind of progress that leads to genuine liberation. The financial realities of gladiator retirement would be comical if they weren't so tragic. Even successful fighters who earn prize money and gifts from admiring fans discover that gladiator expenses are carefully calculated to keep you perpetually in debt to your owner. Equipment maintenance, medical costs, training fees, housing charges, and food expenses are deducted from your earnings at rates that ensure you'll never accumulate enough money to purchase your freedom outright. Historians still argue whether the gladiatorial retirement system was designed to be impossible or merely extremely difficult. But the practical result is the same. Very few fighters ever achieve genuine independence. The system is structured like a pyramid scheme where the only way to advance is to recruit new victims to take your place. And even then, advancement means becoming complicit in the same exploitation you've suffered. Some retired gladiators attempt to leverage their fame into business opportunities, opening taverns or shops that trade on their arena reputation. But Roman commercial law is heavily biased toward established merchant families, and ex-gladiators lack the political connections necessary to navigate the complex world of legitimate business. Your celebrity status might draw customers initially, but maintaining a successful enterprise requires skills that combat training never provided. The social isolation of retirement can be worse than the physical dangers of active fighting. Your former colleagues are either still risking their lives in the arena or dead. Your family relationships have been strained or severed by years of gladiatorial involvement, and civilian society treats you like a curiosity rather than a person. You're trapped between two worlds, too famous to disappear into anonymity, too infamous to be accepted into respectable society. The psychological transition from active gladiator to retired survivor presents challenges that Roman society doesn't acknowledge or address. You've spent years living with the constant possibility of violent death, and suddenly you're expected to adjust to a life where the most dangerous thing you'll encounter is a disagreement with a customer over the price of wine. The adrenaline addiction, the hypervigilance, the inability to trust anyone completely. These survival mechanisms that kept you alive in the arena become obstacles to building a peaceful civilian life. Legal protections for retired gladiators are minimal to non-existent. If someone cheats you in a business deal, assaults you on the street, or refuses to honor a contract, your options for legal recourse are limited by your social status and criminal history. The same legal system that allowed you to be enslaved and forced to fight for entertainment isn't particularly interested in protecting your rights once you're no longer generating tax revenue through ticket sales. The retirement ceremony itself is designed to reinforce the illusion of freedom while actually cementing your continued dependence on the gladiatorial system. You receive your wooden sword in a public ceremony that celebrates your survival and supposed liberation. But the subtext is clear. You're being released from active duty, not from the social and economic structures that define gladiatorial life. The ceremony marks a transition from one form of captivity to another, slightly more comfortable form of captivity. Even the most successful retired gladiators maintain connections to the arena world because it's the only place where their experience has value. You might open a training school for wealthy Romans who want to learn sword fighting as a hobby, or work as a bodyguard for merchants who value your reputation more than your actual protective skills. But these occupations keep you tethered to the violent world you supposedly escaped, and they remind you daily that your value as a person is still measured primarily by your ability to do violence efficiently. The letter arrives on a piece of papyrus that's been handled by so many different messengers that the ink has smeared, but the message is clear enough: your family doesn't want to see you anymore. Not because they don't love you, but because having a gladiator in the family has made their lives unbearable in ways you never considered while you were focused on not dying in the arena. Your sister writes that she can't find a husband because no respectable family wants to be connected to gladiatorial blood, and your aging parents have been ostracized by their community for raising a son who kills people for entertainment. The social contamination of gladiatorial involvement spreads through family networks like a plague, affecting relatives who had nothing to do with your career choice and probably try to talk you out of it. Roman society operates on principles of inherited honor and shame, which means your decision to enter the arena, whether voluntary or forced, reflects on everyone who shares your bloodline. Your nephew gets bullied at school because his uncle is a gladiator. Your brother loses business clients who don't want to associate with gladiatorial families, and your mother can't show her face at the market without enduring whispered comments about her son's profession. The financial aspect of family destruction is particularly cruel because gladiator earnings are often the only thing keeping your relatives from poverty, but accepting that money comes with social costs that can be devastating. Your sister needs the coins you send home to pay for her children's education, but taking gladiator money marks her family as morally compromised in the eyes of their neighbors. It's a choice between financial survival and social respectability, and there's no option that doesn't involve sacrifice. Your children, if you have any, face the worst consequences of your gladiatorial career because they inherit both the social stigma and the genetic legacy of violence that Roman society believes is passed down through bloodlines. Schools refuse to accept them. Other children aren't allowed to play with them, and their prospect for marriage or career advancement are permanently damaged by their connection to the arena. They grow up knowing that their father is simultaneously famous and infamous, celebrated and reviled, successful and cursed. The visits to the ludus become increasingly painful as you watch your family members struggle with the contradiction of loving someone whose profession they find morally repugnant. Your wife tries to be supportive, but you can see the fear in her eyes when she looks at your new scars, the way she flinches when you move too quickly, the careful distance she maintains even during intimate moments. She's not afraid of you exactly, but she's afraid of what you've become and what you might become if the arena changes you further. Historians still argue whether gladiatorial families were genuinely ostracized or if the social penalties were exaggerated for dramatic effect, but the evidence suggests that the stigma was real and long-lasting. Inscriptions on family tombs sometimes omit references to gladiatorial careers, and legal documents show that gladiator families faced restrictions on property ownership, political participation, and marriage options that persisted for generations. The psychological burden on family members is something Roman society doesn't acknowledge because it doesn't fit with the narrative that gladiatorial games are harmless entertainment. Your mother develops what we might recognize as anxiety disorder, constantly worrying about your safety and her family's reputation. Your father starts drinking more heavily because he can't reconcile his pride in your fighting skills with his shame about your profession. Your siblings experience a form of survivor's guilt, wondering if they should have done more to prevent your gladiatorial career or if they're somehow responsible for your situation. The religious complications add another layer of family destruction because gladiatorial involvement creates spiritual pollution that affects everyone in your household. Your family can't participate fully in certain religious ceremonies. Their offerings to the gods are considered less pure, and their prayers for your safety are tainted by the knowledge that they're asking divine protection for someone who makes a living through violence. It's theological catch 22 that puts your family's spiritual welfare at risk. The extended family relationships suffer even more than immediate family bonds because cousins, uncles, and in-laws have even less reason to accept the social costs of your gladiatorial association. Family gatherings become awkward affairs where your presence makes everyone uncomfortable, not because they don't care about you, but because your profession has made normal family interactions impossible. You can't talk about your work without upsetting people, but avoiding the subject creates an elephant in the room tension that's equally uncomfortable. The intergenerational impact of gladiatorial involvement creates family trauma that persists long after your fighting career ends. Your children grow up with a complex relationship to violence. They're proud of your skills and success, but they're also ashamed of how those skills were acquired and displayed. They develop coping mechanisms for dealing with social stigma that can include denial, aggression, or complete withdrawal from social interaction. Marriage prospects for gladiator family members are particularly limited because Roman marriages are essentially business partnerships between families, and associating with gladiatorial blood is bad for business. Your daughter might be beautiful, intelligent, and well-educated, but her connection to the arena makes her unmarriageable to anyone from a respectable family. She'll either remain single, marry someone from a similarly stigmatized background, or marry someone willing to overlook her family connections in exchange for whatever gladiatorial wealth you've accumulated. The communication breakdown between you and your family becomes more pronounced over time because you're living in different worlds with different values and priorities. They're trying to maintain respectability and social standing while you're focused on survival and professional success in a context they find morally repugnant. The conversations become stilted and superficial because the things that matter most to you, training techniques, arena politics, opponent analysis, are exactly the topics your family least wants to discuss. You endure back-breaking daily drills with wooden weapons while your body screams and your spirit slowly dies. The training regimen begins before dawn with a breakfast of barley porridge that tastes like sawdust mixed with disappointment. Then it's straight to the practice yard where wooden posts await your assault, scarred and battered by thousands of previous trainees who stood where you stand now. The training weapons are deliberately heavier than their combat counterparts, designed to build the strength you'll need to survive your first real fight, assuming you live that long. Your gladius trainer, a former Murmillo named Septimus, demonstrates the basic cuts with mechanical precision. Thrust, don't slash. He barks, the point kills faster than the edge. His wooden sword moves in practice patterns while he explains the anatomy of efficient murder. Ribs deflect horizontal cuts, so angle upward. The stomach is soft, but not immediately fatal. The throat is quick but hard to reach. He's teaching you the geometry of death. and you realize that every technique has been refined through the suffering of countless men who learned these lessons the hard way. The training post becomes your constant enemy, a wooden tormentor that never tires, never bleeds, and never dies. You strike it thousands of times until your arms feel like lead and your shoulders burn with exhaustion. Splinters embed themselves in your knuckles, and your hands develop calluses thick as leather. The post is marked with painted targets representing vital organs, and you learn to hit them with mechanical precision even when your vision blurs from fatigue. Shield work is perhaps the most physically demanding aspect of training. The wooden shield is twice the weight of a combat shield, designed to build the strength needed to block repeated blows while maintaining offensive capability. Your left arm becomes a constant source of pain as muscles you never knew existed scream for relief. The shield instructor, a scarred veteran named Lucius, demonstrates blocking techniques while his assistant pounds on your shield with a wooden club. The shield is your life. Lucius repeats between blows. Lose it and you're dead meat rolling in the sand. Footwork drills consume hours of each training day, teaching you to move efficiently while wearing armor and carrying weapons. You learn to advance and retreat, to circle your opponent, to create and exploit openings. The sand of the practice yard is marked with patterns showing proper foot placement, and you repeat the movements until they become automatic. Fight with your feet first, Septimus tells you. A moving target is harder to kill than a stationary one. The irony that you're learning to prolong your own death isn't lost on you. The conditioning exercises are designed to push your body beyond normal human limits. You carry heavy stones, run with full armor, and perform endless repetitions of strength-building exercises. The trainers seem to take perverse pleasure in your suffering, pushing you until you collapse and then pushing harder. Pain is weakness leaving the body. They chant, but you suspect that pain is actually humanity leaving the body, and what's left behind is something that can kill without hesitation. Weapons specialization begins after your first month of basic training. You're assigned a fighting style based on your physical attributes and aptitude. The Gladiatorial fights with net and trident, relying on speed and reach. The Secutor uses sword and shield with heavy armor, emphasizing defense and endurance. The Thrax fights with curved sword and small shield, favoring agility and precision. Each style has its own training regimen, techniques, and philosophy of combat. You're being molded into a specialized instrument of death, fine-tuned for maximum entertainment value. Sparring with other trainees introduces the psychological element of combat that can't be taught with wooden posts. You learn to read your opponent's intentions, to feint and deceive, to exploit fear and hesitation. The first time you successfully land a blow on another trainee, you feel a mixture of triumph and horror that stays with you long after the training session ends. You're becoming good at something that exists only to entertain people who want to watch you die, and that realization is almost as disturbing as the physical pain of training. Historians still argue whether gladiator training was primarily focused on skill development or psychological conditioning, but your experience suggests both elements were crucial. The physical training builds your body into a weapon, but the psychological training transforms your mind into something that can wield that weapon against other human beings. You learn to suppress empathy, to view opponents as obstacles rather than people, to find satisfaction in violence that would have horrified your former self. The medical training that accompanies weapons instruction is grimly practical. You learn to recognize fatal wounds versus survivable ones, how to control bleeding long enough to finish a fight, and how to make a dramatic death if the situation calls for it. The Ludus Doctor demonstrates on wounded prisoners, showing you the difference between cuts that kill quickly and those that provide maximum entertainment value. The crowd wants to see suffering, he explains while pointing out non-vital organs, but they also want to see courage. Learn to give them both. Recovery between training sessions becomes increasingly difficult as your body accumulates damage. Minor injuries that would heal quickly in a normal person become chronic problems when you're forced to train through them. Your hands develop permanent joint damage from gripping weapons. Your shoulders and elbows ache constantly from repetitive motions, and your feet become deformed from the constant footwork drills. You're being systematically broken down and rebuilt as a fighting machine, and the process is destroying your body even before you enter the arena. The trainers themselves are living reminders of where this path leads. Most are former gladiators who survived long enough to earn their freedom, but they're physical wrecks marked by decades of violence. Missing fingers, clouded eyes, scarred faces, and limping gaits tell the story of their careers. They're the lucky ones who lived, but they're also warnings of what survival costs. Even if you win your freedom, you'll carry the marks of your enslavement for the rest of your life, assuming you have a life left to live. Your stomach growls as you stare down at another bowl of pulmentum, the thick barley porridge that's become your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The gladiator diet isn't designed for pleasure. It's engineered like everything else in this brutal system. You're fed to bulk up, to build the kind of muscle that looks impressive when it's getting carved up for entertainment, but you're kept perpetually hungry enough to stay aggressive and desperate. The barley gives you slow-burning energy and makes your muscles swell with retained water, creating that coveted gladiator physique that has wealthy Roman women swooning in the stands. But here's the thing historians love to debate. Some evidence suggests gladiators were actually quite chubby by modern standards, carrying a layer of fat that helped protect vital organs during combat. You're not sculpted like a Marvel superhero. You're built like a medieval knight, thick and solid and designed to absorb punishment. Your fellow gladiators call this slop gladiator bread, though there's precious little bread involved. It's mostly barley, beans, and ash. Yes, actual ash from burn plants that supposedly helps with bone strength. The Lanista explains this with the enthusiasm of a fitness influencer hawking supplements, but you suspect it's mainly because ash is cheap and makes you feel fuller than you actually are. The beans are your primary protein source, and they're prepared exactly the same way every single day. Boiled until they're mushy, seasoned with nothing but salt if you're lucky. Sometimes there's a bit of lard mixed in, but that's reserved for gladiators preparing for big games. The monotony is intentional. Food becomes fuel, not pleasure, and you stop thinking about taste after the first month. Historians still argue whether gladiators received any meat in their regular diet, though most evidence points to it being an occasional luxury for starfighters. You might get some dried fish or a scrap of pork before a major bout, but day to day, you're essentially on an ancient vegan diet supplemented with dairy products that have seen better days. The milk is often sour by the time it reaches your bowl, curdled and chunky with a smell that makes your eyes water. But you drink it anyway because calcium supposedly strengthens bones, and you're going to need every advantage when someone's trying to shatter your ribs with a gladius. The cheese is hard as leather and tastes about as appetizing, but it keeps well in the Mediterranean heat and provides protein that your constantly training body craves. Water is another story entirely. You're given watered-down wine called pasca, which sounds fancy until you realize it's basically vinegar with delusions of grandeur. It's acidic enough to kill most bacteria, which is probably the only reason half the gladiators don't die from dysentery, but it leaves your mouth puckered and your throat burning. Sometimes you wonder if they're trying to toughen you up from the inside out. The truly bizarre part of gladiator nutrition is the supplement routine. You're force-fed various herbal concoctions that are supposed to enhance performance, increase aggression, or speed healing. One popular mixture contains ground-up bones from previous gladiators, because apparently, ancient Romans invented protein powder centuries before anyone thought to add chocolate flavoring. Your meals are timed with military precision. Dawn feeding happens before morning training, when your body is desperate for fuel after a night of fitful sleep on a straw mattress. The midday meal is smaller, just enough to keep you functional during afternoon weapons practice. Evening feeding is the largest, designed to help your battered muscles recover overnight, though recovery is a relative term when you're getting beaten with wooden swords 12 hours later. The dining area is a study in controlled chaos. Hundreds of gladiators hunched over their bowls, wolfing down food like animals, because that's essentially what you've become. Conversation is minimal. Everyone's too focused on consuming enough calories to survive another day of training. The sound of spoons scraping against wood echoes off stone walls, punctuated by the occasional cough or grunt of digestive distress. Some gladiators try to supplement their diet with whatever they can scrounge, trade, or steal. Veteran fighters might have earned enough favor to receive small luxuries, an apple, a piece of real bread, maybe even some honey. But for most of you, especially the newcomers, the official gladiator diet is all you'll taste until you either earn privileges through victory or die trying. The psychological impact of this nutritional monotony is profound. Food becomes purely functional, stripped of any cultural or emotional significance. You stop dreaming about favorite meals from your former life and start calculating whether you've consumed enough calories to swing a sword effectively. It's another layer of dehumanization, turning you into a fighting machine that happens to require fuel. And here's the darkly ironic twist. This supposedly optimal gladiator diet has become trendy among modern fitness enthusiasts. People pay premium prices for ancient warrior nutrition plans based on barley and beans, completely missing the point that this wasn't about health optimization. It was about creating disposable human weapons on the cheapest budget possible, keeping you strong enough to put on a good show, but hungry enough to fight desperately for any scrap of improvement in your circumstances. The tunnel stretches ahead of you like the throat of some massive stone beast, and with each step toward the blinding circle of sunlight at the end, your heart hammers against your ribs like it's trying to escape your chest. This is it. Your first appearance in the arena proper, and the sound washing over you from that bright opening ahead is unlike anything you've ever experienced. It's not just noise. It's a living thing, a roar that seems to shake the very foundations of the amphitheater. Your fellow gladiators nudge you forward because stopping now isn't an option, but your legs feel like they're made of the same wet sand that covers the arena floor. The wooden practice weapons you've been training with for months suddenly feel inadequate preparation for what's waiting in that circle of sand and death. Your trainer's voice echoes in your memory, reminding you to keep your guard up and watch for tells in your opponent's stance. But all of that technical knowledge seems to evaporate as you approach the tunnel's mouth. The temperature changes as you near the exit, the cool stone passageway giving way to the scorching heat of the arena floor. Romans built their amphitheaters to trap and amplify sound, and right now, that architectural feature is working against your sanity. 50,000 voices merge into something that's part celebration, part hunger, and entirely terrifying. They're not cheering for you specifically. They're cheering for the promise of blood, and you're about to provide it. Historians still argue whether gladiators experienced anything like stage fright, or if the constant training somehow immunized them against performance anxiety. But standing here in your first real armor, leather and bronze that's been worn by who knows how many previous fighters, you can confirm that no amount of practice prepares you for this moment. Your mouth is dry as desert sand, and the grip on your gladius is slippery with sweat despite the leather wrapping. The sunlight hits you like a physical blow as you emerge from the tunnel, and for several seconds you're completely blind. The crowd's roar doubles in volume, and you realize they can see you now, this fresh meat stumbling into their entertainment arena. Your eyes adjust gradually, and the sheer scale of the amphitheater hits you like a siege engine. Tiers upon tiers of seats rise up around you, packed with Romans from every social class, all united in their desire to watch you suffer. The arena floor is larger than it looked from the training grounds practice area, but somehow it also feels impossibly small with all those eyes focused on it. Sand has been spread thick to absorb blood, and you can see dark stains from previous bouts that no amount of fresh sand could completely cover. The smell hits you next, a mixture of hot sand, sweat, fear, and something metallic that might be blood or might just be your imagination running wild. Your opponent is already waiting in the center of the arena, and he's everything you hoped he wouldn't be. Experienced, confident, and wearing his scars like decorations. He's a Regimens, armed with net and trident, while you've been assigned the role of secutor with your heavy shield and short sword. The matchup is designed for spectacle. Mobile fisherman versus heavily armored pursuer. But right now, it just feels like you've been set up to fail in the most public way possible. The editor presiding over the games raises his hand, and the crowd falls into an expectant hush that's somehow more unnerving than their roaring. In this brief moment of relative quiet, you can hear your own breathing echoing inside your helmet, can feel every point where your armor chafes against skin that's already slick with nervous sweat. This is the last moment of your old life, even if you survive the next few minutes. The signal drops, and suddenly you're moving, muscle memory from months of training taking over while your conscious mind struggles to process the unreality of the situation. Your opponent circles to your left, looking for an angle to cast his net, and you adjust your stance the way you've practiced thousands of times. But everything feels different under the weight of 50,000 watching eyes. The crowd noise shifts and changes based on every move you make, and you realize they're not just spectators, they're active participants in this deadly dance. They cheer when you stumble slightly in the sand, gasp when your opponent's trident thrust comes close to finding flesh, and roar approval when you manage to land a glancing blow with your shield boss. You're not just fighting your opponent. You're performing for an audience that will determine whether you live or die. The strangest part is how time seems to stretch and compress simultaneously. Seconds feel like hours when you're dodging a net cast, but entire exchanges of blows seem to happen in the blink of an eye. Your trainer warned you about this disorientation, but experiencing it firsthand is like trying to fight underwater while everyone around you moves at normal speed. And somewhere in the back of your mind, past the fear and adrenaline and desperate focus on staying alive, you realize that this is your life now. Win or lose today, assuming you survive, you'll be back here again and again until your luck runs out or your skills fail you. This arena, this sand, this roaring crowd, they're your world now, and escape exists only in the fever dreams you have between training sessions and bouts. The choreography of gladiatorial combat is a dance of death with very specific steps, and you're learning them through a curriculum written in scars and broken bones. Each type of gladiator exists to create a particular kind of spectacle, a carefully balanced matchup designed to maximize crowd engagement and minimize the chance of a boring, quick finish. Your trainers don't just teach you how to fight. They teach you how to die entertainingly, because sometimes that's the most important skill you'll ever learn. As a secutor, you're the pursuing hunter, built to chase down the more mobile retiarius with your heavy rectangular shield and gladius. Your helmet is smooth and rounded specifically so fishing nets can't catch on it, but that same design severely limits your vision and hearing. You're essentially fighting half-blind, relying on peripheral glimpses and the crowd's reaction to track your opponent's movements. It's like playing a video game with most of your screen blacked out, except the penalty for losing isn't just death. It's public humiliation followed by death. The retiarius represents the opposite combat philosophy: mobility over protection, range over armor. His weighted net can entangle you completely if thrown accurately, and his trident gives him reach advantage that can skewer you before you get close enough to use your sword. But he's almost naked except for a shoulder guard, which means any solid hit you land will probably end the fight. The crowd loves this dynamic because it creates natural dramatic tension. The heavily armored turtle versus the quick, deadly fish. Historians still argue whether gladiatorial combat was more choreographed entertainment or genuine attempts at mutual murder, but from your perspective on the sand, the distinction seems academic. Sure, some bouts might be fixed, and veteran fighters sometimes develop enough mutual respect to put on a good show without actually trying to kill each other. But when you're facing a desperate slave who sees victory as his only path to freedom, or a condemned criminal who's got nothing left to lose, the choreography becomes very real very quickly. The weapons themselves are engineered for maximum visual impact. Your gladius is shorter than a legionnaire sword because longer weapons would end fights too quickly. Thrust, parry, stab done. Instead, you're forced into close-quarters combat where every exchange is visible to the crowd, where blood flows frequently enough to keep things interesting, and where stamina becomes as important as skill. It's like someone designed the weapons specifically to make fights last longer and look more dramatic. The different gladiator types create a rock-paper-scissors dynamic that keeps matchups unpredictable. Thrax fighters with their curved swords and small shields are fast, but vulnerable to your heavy frontal assault. Murmillo gladiators share your equipment style, but fight with different techniques, creating mirror matches that showcase pure skill. Daimakaris fighters dual-wield swords without shields, making them glass cannons that can deal massive damage, but fold under sustained attack. Your armor tells its own story of calculated brutality. The leather and bronze plates protect you just enough to survive minor wounds, while leaving plenty of exposed flesh for crowd-pleasing cuts and scrapes. Your shield is large enough to provide real protection, but heavy enough to tire you out over a long fight. Even your sandals are designed for arena combat. Thick soles to handle hot sand, but minimal ankle protection so a well-placed cut can hamstring you dramatically. The arena's sand isn't just for absorbing blood. It's carefully maintained to provide specific fighting conditions. Too soft and heavy fighters get bogged down. Too hard and fallen gladiators can't get up quickly enough to continue the show. Arena slaves rake and water the sand between bouts, sometimes adding sawdust or even perfumed herbs to mask the smell of previous bloodshed. It's like stage management for a theater where the stage occasionally eats the actors. Training teaches you to read your opponent's fighting style within the first few exchanges because different gladiator types have predictable patterns. Regimens always try to establish distance first, then cast their nets when you overcommit to an attack. Thrax fighters probe, with quick cuts, looking for openings to land their signature curved sword strikes. But real combat introduces variables that training can't replicate. Desperation, injury, crowd pressure, and the simple fact that someone is actually trying to kill you. The most brutal aspect of gladiatorial mechanics is how they're designed to create multiple climax points in a single fight. First blood gets the crowd excited, but it's rarely enough to end things. Major wounds create dramatic moments where fighters have to adapt their techniques to compensate for injuries. Equipment failures, broken weapons, damaged armor, lost shields, force improvisation that can completely change the fight's dynamic. Your trainers emphasize that stamina management is crucial because crowds get bored if fights end too quickly, but they also get restless if combat drags on too long. You need to pace yourself like a middle-distance runner while simultaneously trying to murder someone who's trying to murder you back. It's an exhausting balancing act that requires you to think tactically even while blood loss and adrenaline are scrambling your decision-making abilities. The psychological warfare is just as important as the physical combat. Experienced gladiators develop signature moves, victory celebrations, and crowd interaction techniques that can intimidate newer fighters before the actual fighting even begins. You learn to watch for tells, subtle shifts in stance, breathing patterns, and movements that might give you a split-second advantage when everything depends on reading your opponent's intentions faster than they can execute them. The mob in the stands isn't just watching your fight. They're participating in it, and their collective mood swings control your fate more directly than your skill with a sword ever could. 50,000 Romans don't just want to see combat. They want to feel like they're part of something larger than themselves. And you're the instrument through which they experience power, bloodlust, and the intoxicating rush of holding life and death in their hands. Welcome to the original crowdsourced entertainment, where audience participation can literally get you killed. The sound they make changes throughout your fight, like a living soundtrack to your potential death. When you land a solid hit, their roar has a different quality than when you take damage, sharper, more excited, with an edge of sadistic pleasure that makes your skin crawl even as you're bleeding. They've developed a vocabulary of noise that experienced gladiators learn to read like sheet music, because understanding the crowd's mood can mean the difference between mercy and execution when you're lying wounded in the sand. Roman crowds are stratified by social class, but blood has a way of democratizing even the most rigid hierarchy. Senators and slaves cheer with equal enthusiasm when someone's guts are spilling onto the arena floor, though they express their bloodlust with different levels of sophistication. The wealthy spectators in the lower tiers might applaud politely when you execute a particularly skillful maneuver, while the masses in the upper seats scream themselves hoarse and throw things when the action slows down. Historians still argue whether the infamous thumbs up or down gesture actually determined gladiators' fates, or if it's just a Hollywood myth that's oversimplified a more complex system of crowd interaction. But you can confirm that the audience definitely signals their preferences for mercy or execution, and the editor presiding over the games usually follows their lead, because disappointing 50,000 Romans is bad for everyone's health, including his own. The crowd psychology operates on pack mentality principles that would make a wolf behavioral specialist proud. Individual spectators might feel sympathy for a wounded gladiator, but once the group dynamic takes over, that same person will scream for blood with genuine enthusiasm. You're not fighting just your opponent. You're fighting the collective ID of Roman society, all their repressed violence and frustrated aggression channeled through their reactions to your performance. They have favorites, and crowd loyalty can shift faster than Roman politics. A gladiator who's beloved one month can find himself facing hostile audiences the next if he delivers a few boring performances or shows too much mercy to defeated opponents. The crowd wants their heroes to be simultaneously skilled enough to provide good entertainment and vulnerable enough to create dramatic tension. It's like being a professional athlete whose fans literally want to see you die for their amusement. The betting adds another layer of complexity to crowd dynamics. Spectators have money riding on specific outcomes, which means they're not just emotionally invested in your performance. They're financially invested too. A rich merchant who's wagered heavily on your victory will scream encouragement and try to distract your opponent, while someone who's bet against you might throw objects or shout insults designed to break your concentration at crucial moments. The crowd's attention span is both shorter and longer than you'd expect. They'll lose interest quickly if a fight becomes too technical or defensive, but they'll stay engaged for surprisingly long periods when combat maintains the right balance of skill, drama, and bloodshed. Managing crowd engagement becomes part of your tactical considerations. Sometimes you need to take unnecessary risks or eschew defensive strategies just to keep the audience happy. Women in the crowd present their own unique psychological dynamic. Roman society restricts their participation in public violence, so the arena becomes an outlet for aggressive impulses they can't express elsewhere. Some of the most bloodthirsty screams come from wealthy matrons who spend the rest of their lives embroidering and managing households. The gladiatorial games give them permission to embrace their darkest impulses without social consequences. The seasonal and political contexts affect crowd mood in ways that can blindside inexperienced fighters. Games held during religious festivals have different energy than those celebrating military victories or political appointments. A crowd that's angry about grain shortages or unhappy with recent government policies might take out their frustrations on gladiators, demanding more blood and showing less mercy than usual. Your relationship with the crowd becomes parasitic in both directions. You need their approval to survive, but their bloodlust feeds on your pain and fear. The more desperate you become, the more excited they get, which creates a feedback loop that can push fights into genuinely savage territory. It's like being trapped in an abusive relationship with 50,000 people simultaneously. The most disturbing aspect of crowd psychology in the gladiatorial context is how quickly civilized people can revert to primal bloodlust when given social permission. These same Romans who pride themselves on law, order, and cultural sophistication become a howling mob the moment someone starts bleeding in the sand. Your death becomes their entertainment, your suffering their pleasure, and they'll go home afterward to complain about the quality of the wine served at intermission. The whispered conversations in the gladiator quarters about escape plans and uprising strategies always end the same way, with someone pointing out that Spartacus and his followers were eventually hunted down and crucified by the thousands along the Appian Way, their bodies left to rot as a permanent reminder of what happens when slaves forget their place. But desperation has a way of making even the most hopeless plans seem worth attempting, and you find yourself listening to the same impossible schemes that have gotten countless gladiators tortured to death over the decades. The logistics of gladiator rebellion are stacked against success from the very beginning because the Ludus system is designed specifically to prevent coordinated resistance. You're housed in small groups that are deliberately mixed to include different nationalities, languages, and backgrounds, making communication and trust building extremely difficult. Your trainers are former gladiators who understand exactly how desperate fighters think, and they're skilled at identifying and eliminating potential troublemakers before organized resistance can develop. The weapons you train with are either wooden practice implements or real weapons that are carefully controlled and counted after every session. Any plan that involves armed rebellion must somehow overcome the fact that you don't have reliable access to actual weapons. The guards are heavily armed and professionally trained, and the Ludus architecture is designed to make escape virtually impossible. It's like planning a prison break from a facility that was specifically engineered by people who spent their careers thinking about prison breaks. The few successful gladiator escapes in recorded history involved either bribery, outside assistance, or extraordinary circumstances that can't be replicated by desperate slaves with no money and no allies. Most escape attempts end with the fugitives being recaptured within days, and the punishments for attempted escape are carefully designed to be worse than anything you'd experience in the arena. Crucifixion is actually one of the less creative options available to Ludus owners dealing with rebellious property. Your fellow gladiators who talk about rebellion fall into predictable categories: the newly enslaved who haven't yet accepted their situation, the veterans who've lost hope of legitimate freedom, and the genuinely unhinged who've been driven insane by repeated trauma. The conversations are therapeutic in a way because they allow people to fantasize about agency and control in a situation where they have neither, but they're also dangerous because the authorities encourage informants and reward gladiators who report rebellion planning. Historians still argue whether gladiator rebellions were common occurrences that were systematically suppressed from historical records, or rare events that were well documented precisely because they were so unusual. But from your perspective lying on a straw mattress and listening to whispered fantasies about burning down the Ludus, the frequency seems less important than the consistent pattern of failure and brutal punishment. The Spartacus Rebellion, which is simultaneously the inspiration and the cautionary tale for every gladiator who dreams of freedom, demonstrates both the potential and the limitations of organized slave resistance. Even with exceptional leadership, military expertise, and favorable circumstances, the rebellion ultimately failed because the Roman state had resources and organizational capabilities that no group of escaped slaves could match. The fact that it took 2 years and multiple legions to suppress Spartacus's army is simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. The psychological dynamics of rebellion planning reveal how desperate gladiators become when all legitimate paths to freedom are blocked. You find yourself seriously considering plans that any rational analysis would reveal as suicidal, because the alternative, accepting permanent enslavement and eventual death in the arena, feels equally hopeless. The rebellion fantasies provide a sense of agency and purpose that's otherwise absent from gladiatorial life, even when everyone involved knows the plans are probably impossible. The informant networks that exist within every Ludus mean that rebellion planning is inherently compromised from the start. Some gladiators report escape plans because they've been bribed or coerced by the authorities, others because they genuinely believe cooperation will improve their treatment, and still others because they're competing with potential rebels for limited privileges and opportunities. The social dynamics of slave communities create internal conflicts that make unified resistance extremely difficult. The punishment protocols for attempted rebellion are designed to deter future attempts through the application of creative brutality that makes regular gladiatorial combat look humane by comparison. Crucifixion is just the beginning. Attempted rebels might be tortured publicly, used as live practice targets for other gladiators, or subjected to creative punishments that combine maximum pain with maximum public visibility. The goal is ensuring that everyone who might consider rebellion understands exactly what failure will cost them. The outside support networks that successful escapes require are virtually non-existent for most gladiators because your family and friends either lack the resources to help or are too frightened of Roman retribution to risk involvement. Unlike other forms of slavery where escape might involve returning to a home community, gladiators often come from distant territories or have been enslaved so long that their original social connections have been severed. You're essentially planning to escape into a world where you have no allies, no resources, and a very distinctive skill set that makes you easy to identify. The timing considerations for rebellion attempts illustrate the catch 22 of gladiatorial resistance. New gladiators might have the motivation and desperation necessary for rebellion, but they lack the skills, knowledge, and internal connections needed for successful escape. Veteran gladiators have the expertise and relationships that could make rebellion possible, but they've also been conditioned by years of systematic brutality to understand that resistance is futile. The window of opportunity, when someone has both the capability and the motivation for rebellion, is extremely narrow. The most tragic aspect of gladiatorial rebellion attempts is how they often result from the same qualities that make someone an effective fighter: courage, determination, willingness to take risks, and refusal to accept defeat. The characteristics that help you survive in the arena are exactly the traits that make you likely to attempt hopeless escapes and suffer brutal punishment for your defiance. Your strengths become weaknesses, and your virtues become the source of your ultimate destruction. The crowd that screams your name today will forget you exist before the sand from your final bout has been raked clean, and the realization that your entire life's struggle amounts to momentary entertainment for people who view you as expendable livestock is perhaps the cruelest truth of gladiatorial existence. You're not building a legacy or fighting for immortal glory. You're participating in a disposable spectacle that will be replaced by next week's games without anyone pausing to remember your name or acknowledge your sacrifice. The record keeping for gladiatorial careers is minimal and utilitarian, focused on win-loss statistics and revenue generation rather than personal achievement or human dignity. Your ludus maintains basic records of your fights, injuries, and financial value, but these documents are business ledgers rather than historical chronicles. When you die, your name might be carved on a cheap tombstone if your earnings were sufficient to cover the expense, but most gladiator graves are unmarked plots and cemeteries reserved for slaves and criminals. The audience members who cheer for your victories and gasp at your near defeats are consuming you as entertainment in the most literal sense. Your suffering becomes their pleasure, your skill becomes their amusement, and your death becomes their climactic moment. But their relationship to you is the same as their relationship to the exotic animals, theatrical performances, and athletic competitions that comprise the full day's entertainment. You're one act in a variety show, and when your performance ends, their attention moves on to the next spectacle. The social dynamics of gladiatorial fame are designed to maximize your utility as entertainment while minimizing your identity as a human being. The crowd develops favorite fighters and follows certain careers with enthusiasm, but they're invested in you as a character in an ongoing drama rather than as a person with genuine hopes, fears, and aspirations. You're simultaneously celebrated and dehumanized, famous and anonymous, successful and utterly powerless. Your fellow gladiators represent the only people who truly understand your experience, but they're also your competitors for limited resources and opportunities. The friendships you develop are genuine but fragile, constantly threatened by the possibility that you might be forced to fight each other in the arena. Even the strongest bonds between gladiators are undermined by the knowledge that survival might require killing someone you care about for the entertainment of people who don't care about either of you. Historians still argue whether any gladiators achieved lasting fame that transcended their entertainment value, but the evidence suggests that even the most celebrated fighters were ultimately remembered for their spectacular deaths rather than their lives. Spartacus is remembered for his rebellion, not his individual combat skills, and most other gladiator names that survive in historical records are mentioned only in connection with particularly dramatic or unusual arena events. The physical remnants of your gladiatorial career will disappear as quickly as everything else connected to your life. Your weapons will be cleaned and redistributed to other fighters. Your armor will be repaired and reused, and your personal possessions will be sold or distributed to settle your debts to the ludus. The cell where you lived will house another gladiator within days of your death, and the training equipment you used will continue to prepare new fighters for the same fate you met. The cultural impact of gladiatorial games persists long after individual gladiators are forgotten because the institution serves social and political functions that transcend any particular performer. The games provide mass entertainment, demonstrate state power, offer opportunities for political advancement, and channel social tensions in ways that benefit the ruling class. Your individual contribution to this system is insignificant compared to the systemic forces that maintain gladiatorial tradition regardless of who participates. The religious and spiritual dimensions of gladiatorial legacy are equally hollow because the rituals and ceremonies associated with the games focus on honoring the state, the gods, and the sponsors rather than acknowledging the humanity of the participants. Your death might be dedicated to a deity or offered as part of a religious festival, but you're functioning as a sacrificial offering rather than as a person whose life has inherent value and meaning. The economic legacy of your gladiatorial career flows entirely to other people. The ludus owner who invested in your training, the promoters who organized your fights, the vendors who sold refreshments to your audience, and the government officials who collected taxes on gladiatorial revenues. You generate wealth for everyone except yourself, and when you die, that wealth generation simply transfers to your replacement without any acknowledgement of your contribution. The artistic and cultural representations of gladiatorial life that appear in mosaics, paintings, and literature focus on the dramatic and exciting aspects of arena combat, while ignoring the human cost and individual suffering involved. You're depicted as a heroic figure engaged in noble combat, rather than as a slave forced to risk death for other people's entertainment. The artistic legacy transforms your exploitation into heroism and your suffering into glory. The family legacy of gladiatorial involvement is typically shame and social stigma rather than pride and achievement. Your children and grandchildren will be marked by their connection to the arena in ways that limit their opportunities and social advancement. The name you hope to honor through gladiatorial success becomes a burden for your descendants to carry, a reminder of the compromises and sacrifices that necessity forced upon your family. The ultimate legacy of your gladiatorial career is the demonstration that human life can be reduced to entertainment value and that individual suffering is acceptable when it serves collective amusement. You're not remembered as a person who lived, struggled, and died with dignity. You're remembered as a performer who provided temporary diversion for an audience that moved on to other forms of entertainment the moment your performance ended. Your life becomes a footnote in someone else's story, a minor detail in the broader narrative of Roman imperial power and cultural decadence.